Today I want to talk about something that some health IT project managers love and some hate, and that is RACI tables. So if you've been working in health IT for any length of time, chances are pretty high that you've been involved in project work. And one of the things that keeps projects moving is clarity around roles. I'm not talking about job titles. I'm talking about who is actually doing the work, who owns the outcome, who is responsible for making decisions, and who is kept informed along the way. So RACI, as you may know, stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. The responsible role is the individual or group who is completing the task. The accountable role is the person who owns the outcome and has the authority to make it move forward. The consulted role includes people who need to provide input before the decision or activity can be completed. And the informed role includes people or groups who need awareness but aren't expected to provide input before the work continues. Health IT work often crosses multiple teams, and sometimes those teams can have overlapping responsibilities. So you've got informatics groups that understand the workflows, application teams that are responsible for the build, reporting teams that are going to take data and do the downstream reporting, understand how that flows together, as well as operational stakeholders who have a say in how it's actually going to be performed once it's put into production. So if there isn't clarity, all that can get kind of messy, especially for things that are complex, where there's a lot of moving parts. So when you're creating a RACI, it doesn't need to be complicated and it doesn't need to go down to the super granular level. In fact, if it does go down to the really granular level, it usually gets overwhelming, too long, and very difficult to maintain. So for most mid to large size project RACIs are really the most beneficial when they are focused on things that tend to become unclear or where there is a question and there is potential for more than one person to actually accomplish or be responsible for that task. The goal is really to clarify the responsibility for various pieces of work when there's multiple teams that need to coordinate with one another. So let's say you have some regulatory changes that you need to implement, and they're going to be impacting ClinDoc design. So there's a new fields that end users need to capture in order to meet some sort of regulatory reporting requirement. You may have the informatics lead be the responsible party and document it on the RACI as the one that is responsible for making sure that the finalized workflow is signed off by the operational team. For those final workflows, you're going to have SMEs that are listed as individuals that need to be consulted on that, because they're obviously going to participate in talking about how the workflow is going to go and what it's going to look like in the end. You're also going to have your build analysts that are going to be consulted because they're going to let you know whether the system has the capabilities and the functionality to achieve what it is that the design is aiming to do. And then you may have other teams like training or your support teams that need to be informed when that design is finally signed off so that they can prepare themselves for their portions of work which rely on it. So they don't actually have input into the decision making itself, but they do have things that flow off of that decision making, and it's important for them to know what decision was made. Having a RACI document really helps you avoid unnecessary assumptions, and we all know that in anything related to health IT, assumptions is where things can get messy. You end up in situations where one team thinks the other team is handling communication, someone assumes that an operational leader has approved workflow when they actually haven't, build assumes trainers are going to grab their own screenshots from the test environment, and the trainers assume that the build team is going to send them the screenshots over email. You get where I'm going with this. A RACI really just makes it easier for everyone to see and understand how those roles fit in, aligned with certain work packages or work activities. Now, it's also important to talk about when it might be worthwhile to create a RACI, because you don't necessarily want to create one for absolutely every project that you have. If you've got a small enhancement request or a project that has contained work that the teams are used to doing, there's a defined or limited number of groups that are participating, and everyone really understands what their role in all of that is from the get-go, then documenting a RACI might just be additional overhead that's not really necessary and never looked at again. It's much more useful if you're in a situation where the individuals or groups that are involved haven't been collaborating on something like that before, or when it's larger and there's multiple different teams with multiple different stakeholders and multiple threads, and there is opportunity for there to be some misunderstandings or it's not quite as clear who would be responsible for what at what point. If you are working on a project where a RACI table is going to be completed, it's usually done fairly early on As soon as the scope is well enough understood that there are activities and work packages that can be created off of it. It doesn't need to be finalized before every detail is known, but it should be created early enough to guide how teams are going to work together. It also should never be created in isolation. So the project manager can absolutely draft the RACI, but in order for it to be meaningful, the project team needs to have input into what everything says. Another thing to think about is in some situations, a project may have more than one RACI. So if a project is small or has contained items in the work package, that can all fit on one page and it all makes sense, it's not too long, then that's great. One RACI is all you need. But if you're working on something that is multi-threaded, super complex, or has many, many teams involved, it might make more sense to have a few different RACIs that are contained for particular aspects of the project so they can be more meaningful. So for example, you might have a RACI that is looking solely at testing components and another that is looking at day-in-the-life responsibilities. When you're creating RACIs for projects, there's a couple common mistakes that you want to keep an eye on. First is having it be too detailed. If every single task is on that RACI, as I mentioned earlier, it gets far too complicated, difficult to read, and it's really hard to maintain. The second is if you have too many people assigned to being accountable. Accountability needs to be really clear. If everybody's accountable, nobody's accountable. And the third is having too many people in that consulting category. You want to be really deliberate with where you put those consultings, and it needs to be individuals who actually need to provide input in order for decisions or activities to be able to move forward. If you have C's beside everybody, then everybody is happy to provide an opinion, and you sometimes can get quite bogged down in trying to figure out whose opinions you're supposed to listen to. So clarity around those C's is a big one. And the final one that I'll mention is creating a RACI and then never looking at it again. If no one's using it when questions come up, then it's not helpful for the project. So they are meant to provide clarity, they're meant to be referenced. If they need to be modified along the way, if additional changes or things come up, and you recognize that there's more groups that need to be added or roles that need to be shifted, then that actually needs to happen. But they should be a living document that's frequently referenced and placed in a location so it's easily accessible to anyone who's on there, including all those people who are informed. It really is meant to be a shared reference point. For Health IT project managers, the practical takeaway is this. Use a RACI when work crosses teams, responsibilities overlap, or stakeholder roles need to be clarified. Keep it focused on meaningful areas of work. Create it with input from the people that are involved. Review it when the project changes, and use it as a reference point when roles or decisions need to be clarified. That's all I have for today's video. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you again next time.